The History of Everything You Use, Episode 10, Ice, the Cold Empire. Opening. Welcome back. Tonight we continue our slow journey through the histories of the ordinary things that fill our days. The objects and substances so familiar to us that they have become almost invisible. We have followed salt, coffee, sugar, bread, tea, spices, chocolate, cutlery, and the fermented drinks that predate almost everything. Tonight we turn to something even stranger. Something you dropped into a glass this evening, perhaps, without a thought. Something that today costs almost nothing, and yet, for most of human history, was one of the strangest, most improbable, and most valuable luxuries on Earth. It sits in your freezer, right now, in trays or a hopper, hundreds of small, hard cubes, ready to fall into a glass with a musical clink. You might have used it earlier this evening to chill a drink. In a few hours, you may use it again without thinking about it. It is one of the most disposable and taken for granted substances in the modern world. And yet, only 2 centuries ago, for a wealthy American in Charleston or a British colonial officer in Calcutta, to have a cool drink in July was a small miracle, made possible by ships loaded with frozen New England lake water sailing across the tropics. Tonight, we are going to talk about ice. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back with mine. Through the snow cellars of Persia and Roman Rome, through the ice houses of Ottoman sultans, through the frozen ports of Boston and Norway, all the way back to a time when, to preserve winter into summer, and to move winter across an ocean, was one of the strangest and most ambitious industries ever undertaken by human beings. Part 1. The Ancient Craving for Cold. We must start with a fact so obvious that it is easy to forget. For all but a tiny sliver of human history, if you lived in a hot place in summer, you had no cold. There was no way to make a drink cool, no way to preserve food against spoiling, no way to soothe a fever with a compress that stayed cold for more than a minute or two. The cold was a phenomenon of winter and mountains. It came and went with the season, and no one, in most times and most places, could hold on to it. And yet, for as long as we have written records, the human desire for coldness has been intense and inventive, because there was one way to hold winter's cold into the summer, and human beings figured it out very early. You could carry snow and ice down from the mountains, or gather it during winter, and bury it in insulated pits so deep and well packed that some of it would survive the warm months. It would slowly melt, but if you started with a great deal and packed it carefully with straw or sawdust, enough would remain in July for the wealthiest household to have chilled fruit and cool drinks. Roman emperors did this. Nero, according to Pliny the Elder, drank a beverage called decocta, made from water that had been boiled to purify it, then cooled in snow packed in special glass containers. Snow was hauled from the Apennine Mountains by teams of couriers. It was a fantastic luxury, an emperor's toy, and it announced Nero's power more than his wealth. Alexander the Great, 3 centuries earlier, is said to have dug snow pits at Petra to cool wine for his men. The Chinese emperors of the Zhou dynasty maintained an official called the Bing-zheng, the ice master, responsible for cutting winter ice from rivers, storing it in stone cellars, and distributing it during summer ceremonies. The most sophisticated of all these ancient traditions may have been in Persia. Persian engineers, working perhaps as early as the 4th century BC, developed a structure the world still marvels at today, the yakhchāl. These were tall, conical mud brick structures, sometimes reaching 15 or 20 meters high, built above deep underground storage chambers. Water was channeled into shallow pools during winter nights, allowed to freeze, and then transferred to the storage chamber below. The remarkable insulation of the yakhchāl, thick walls, an internal shape that trapped cold air, and often a wind catcher to pull warm air away, meant that ice cut in January could still be lifted from the chamber in August. Some of these Persian ice houses survive today, standing in the deserts of Iran, silent monuments to how badly human beings once wanted their sherbet cold. The Islamic world inherited and elaborated on this Persian tradition. Ottoman sultans in Istanbul maintained ice cellars supplied by porters who hauled snow down from Bursa and Uludağ. Snow-cooled sherbets, a whole family of chilled sweet drinks flavoured with fruit, rose, tamarind, sandalwood or violet, became one of the great luxuries of Ottoman court life. The very word sherbet, from Arabic sharba, meaning simply a drink, entered English through Ottoman refinement, alongside its cousin sorbet, which reached Europe and became the sweetened ice dessert we still know. Every scoop of sorbet at a European restaurant is a small linguistic descendant of an Istanbul ice cellar. But all of this, Persian, Roman, Chinese, Ottoman, Mughal, was for the very rich. Ice was a luxury of emperors and sultans. The common person, in every land, drank warm water in July, ate stale bread that had begun to sour, and swatted flies over meat that could not be preserved. Cold was for kings. Part 2. The American Who Sold Winter. The story of how ice became a common substance, how it descended from emperor's toy to bartender's tool, has one central figure. His name was Frederic Tudor, and his life is one of the strangest entrepreneurial stories in all of American history. Tudor was born in 1783 in Boston, the son of a prominent lawyer. As a young man, he was, by his own family's account, not particularly promising. He was too impatient for formal education. He worked briefly in trade, and in 1805, at the age of 22, at a family gathering, his brother William casually suggested a strange idea. What if the ice on the New England ponds in winter, free, abundant, useless, could be cut, shipped to the West Indies, and sold to tropical planters who had never in their lives touched a piece of ice? Everyone else present laughed. Frederic Tudor did not laugh. He wrote in his diary that he intended to build this business and to become wealthy from it, and he did not care how ridiculous it sounded. Within a few months, he had begun making plans. He would harvest ice from Massachusetts ponds in February, insulate it in sawdust and hay, load it into the hold of a ship, and sail it to Martinique. The first voyage in 1806 was a financial disaster. The ice arrived, remarkably given the technology of the time, but the planters of Martinique did not know what to do with it. Nobody had ever sold them ice before. There was no infrastructure. There was no bar culture that needed it. The blocks melted on the docks while Tudor tried to explain his product to skeptical merchants. He lost thousands of dollars. He went into debt. He was, at various points in the next decade, briefly imprisoned for his debts. But he did not give up. Slowly, painfully, and against every economic instinct of his time, Tudor began to build not merely a supply chain, but a market. In Havana, he taught bartenders how to chill drinks. In New Orleans, he insinuated ice into the coffee shops. In Charleston, he convinced pharmacists to prescribe iced compresses for fever. He gave ice away at first to teach people to want it, and once they had wanted it, they would not do without it. By the 1820s, Tudor had figured out enough of the puzzle to be profitable. By the 1830s, he was very rich. And he had been joined by a partner, a New England inventor named Nathaniel Wyeth, who developed the mechanical ice plough, a horse-drawn device that scored the surface of a frozen pond into a grid of perfectly square blocks, greatly accelerating harvesting. The industrial ice trade was born. At its height in the mid-19th century, the American ice industry was staggering in scale. Tens of thousands of workers cut ice each winter from ponds and rivers across New England and the Great Lakes. Insulated warehouses stored millions of tons. Ice ships sailed to every warm port in the Americas and beyond. New Orleans, Havana, Rio de Janeiro, and even more remotely, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, and Manila became regular customers. The Boston to Calcutta ice trade was, in particular, one of the great wonders of the 19th century. It began in 1833, when a Tudor ship called the Tuscany sailed from Boston with 180 tons of ice in its hold. Boston to Calcutta is a voyage of roughly 4 months. The ship crossed the equator twice, once on the way down, once on the way up around the Cape of Good Hope. The ice sat in a specially insulated hold, packed in pine sawdust, sailing through the tropics. When the Tuscany arrived at Calcutta, roughly a third of the ice had melted, but 2/3 remained. The British colonial community of Calcutta, who had lived for generations without cold, went into raptures. They built ice houses to receive the shipments. They formed subscription clubs to be certain of a regular supply. American ice, in Calcutta, sold for prices that made Boston pond ice one of the most profitable exports of New England. This trade continued for decades. Between 1833 and 1870, American ships carried perhaps hundreds of thousands of tons of frozen Massachusetts water to Indian ports. Ordinary Bengalis called the imported American ice Wenham ice, after the name of the New England town whose ponds were most famously harvested. A generation of Anglo-Indian children grew up drinking iced lemonade produced from a lake they had never seen and would never see, cut by workers whose language they did not speak, in a country on the other side of the world. Try to hold this in your mind for a moment. Water, harvested in New England in February, sailing through 6 months of tropical heat, arriving in India, and still being cold when it got there. This is one of the strangest logistical achievements in history, and it was done not by a state, not by an empire, but by a private American businessman who refused to accept his family's mockery. Part 3. The Norwegian ice. As the ice trade grew, other regions began to enter it. The most important new supplier in the second half of the 19th century was Norway. Norwegian ice was cut from fjords and mountain lakes and shipped to Britain and continental Europe in staggering quantities. British merchants especially bought Norwegian ice for the London fish trade, because a fish caught in the North Sea, packed with ice, could reach a London table 2 days later still fresh. The fishmongers of Billingsgate Market in London became major consumers. Norwegian ice fed the great Victorian appetite for fresh cod, herring and sole. Norwegian ice cooled beer in London pubs. Norwegian ice made possible the elegant iced desserts of upper-class Victorian dinner parties. By the 1880s, Norway was exporting hundreds of thousands of tons of ice a year, and small Norwegian coastal towns had been transformed by the trade. Ice also transformed something even more consequential. It revolutionized meat. The American ice industry was crucial to the rise of a whole new food system in the second half of the 19th century. Ice-cooled railroad cars, refrigerator cars, developed and perfected from the 1870s onward, allowed slaughtered cattle in Chicago to be shipped, chilled, to New York and Boston as fresh meat, weeks after slaughter. Before ice cars, meat had to travel on the hoof, as living animals. After ice cars, meat could travel as a product. The great Chicago meatpacking industry, brutal, industrial, and enormous, depended on ice. Even more consequentially, ice made possible the international meat trade. Frozen beef from Argentina and Australia in refrigerated ships that were still, at first, cooled by natural ice or by mechanical refrigeration and ice combined, began reaching British ports in the 1880s. British consumers, for the first time in history, ate meat from cattle grazed on other continents. The eating habits of Europe were transformed forever. And it happened, first, on the backs of blocks of pond water. Part 4. Ice in the Home. The American middle class, from the 1830s onward, began to adopt an entirely new piece of household furniture, the icebox. It was, in appearance, a wooden cabinet lined with tin or zinc and insulated with cork or sawdust. Inside, it had a small compartment at the top for a block of ice and shelves below for food. Cold air, denser than warm, sank from the ice compartment to keep the food chilled. A drip pan below caught the meltwater. Every few days, a home with an icebox needed a new block of ice. And so, in every American town of any size, the Iceman became a fixture of daily life. He drove a horse-drawn wagon along regular routes. Housewives placed a card in the window signalling how large a block they wanted. £25, £50, £100. The Iceman would climb down from his wagon, hoist a block onto his shoulder with a pair of iron tongs, and carry it into the kitchen. Children in tenement neighbourhoods would follow the ice wagon for the small chips that fell from the block, chewing them like the treats they were. The Iceman was, for perhaps 60 years, one of the most familiar working figures in the American city. He appeared in songs, in vaudeville jokes, in early films. He is remembered in the American phrase, "The Iceman cometh," later used famously as the title of a play by Eugene O'Neill. In American cities from about 1830 to 1930, the Iceman was as ordinary and expected a presence on the street as, today, the postman. The trade was regional in Europe too, though it depended more on local ice for shorter distances. In Britain, ice deliveries to butchers and fishmongers were universal. In France and Italy, urban restaurants relied on it. And an entire romance of ice, of frosty windows and cool rooms and pale sherbets, coloured the imagination of the 19th century middle class. Part 5. The End of the Ice Empire. But even as the ice industry reached its peak, its doom was being invented in laboratories on both sides of the Atlantic. The idea of making artificial cold, of using a machine rather than winter to freeze things, was not new. As early as 1755, a Scottish chemist named William Cullen had demonstrated that evaporating a volatile fluid could produce cold. This is the fundamental principle behind all modern refrigeration. But turning that principle into a working machine took a century of gradual engineering. By the 1860s and 1870s, various inventors in Germany, France, Britain, Australia, and the United States were building working refrigeration machines using ammonia, sulfur dioxide, or other volatile fluids. These early machines were enormous, dangerous, and expensive. But they had one advantage that ice could not match. They could produce cold anywhere, without winter, without harvesting, without shipping. The first industry to be transformed was breweries. German brewers, especially, adopted mechanical refrigeration eagerly through the 1870s and 1880s because it allowed them to make lager year-round. Lager fermentation requires steady, cool temperatures, and before mechanical refrigeration, lager could only be brewed in winter and stored in cool cellars. Mechanical refrigeration liberated German beer from the calendar. Then came the packing plants. By 1900, the great Chicago meatpackers and their equivalents in Argentina and Australia had shifted from natural ice to mechanical refrigeration. Refrigerated ships crossed oceans using compressor-driven cold. And then, most decisively, mechanical refrigeration began to enter the home. The first practical domestic refrigerator, using an electric motor and a sealed refrigeration circuit, was developed in the 1910s and became a commercial product in the 1920s. General Electric introduced its monitor-top refrigerator in 1927. Kelvinator, Frigidaire, Westinghouse, and a growing number of manufacturers followed. Through the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, the electric refrigerator swept through American middle-class homes, and then through European and eventually global homes. And the ice industry died. It did not die suddenly, and it did not die completely, but it withered. The Iceman lost his customers, first one household at a time, then whole streets at a time, then whole neighborhoods. By 1950, in most American cities, the ice wagon had disappeared. The great insulated warehouses of the ice trade were converted to other uses or abandoned. The lakes and ponds of New England, once cut open every winter for their frozen crop, went back to being quiet water. The ice industry that Frederic Tudor had built and that hundreds of thousands of workers had laboured in, and that had transformed food consumption on 3 continents, lasted, in its full form, roughly 100 years. It rose from nothing in 1806 and was essentially gone by the 1950s. In the great story of human industries, it is one of the shortest and strangest chapters. A whole empire of cold, built for a century, dissolved in a generation, replaced by a small motor humming quietly in every kitchen. Part 6. What the refrigerator really changed. We have already, in an earlier episode, noted the immense consequences of refrigeration for the story of salt, but it is worth returning here to emphasize just how transformative the arrival of the refrigerator has been for daily life. Before refrigeration, food was highly local and highly seasonal. You ate what grew nearby and what could be preserved by drying, salting, smoking, pickling, or fermenting. Milk was drunk within hours of milking, or it was made immediately into butter or cheese. Meat was consumed within a day or two, or it was salted, smoked, or dried. Fish was eaten fresh only if you lived near the water. Otherwise it came salted or pickled. Vegetables were eaten in their season and stored through winter in root cellars or preserved. After refrigeration, all of this changed. Milk could be kept fresh for a week. Meat could be stored for days without any preservation other than cold. Fish could be shipped fresh from distant coasts. Fruits and vegetables could travel across continents and still arrive edible. The industrial food system that most of us in wealthy countries now take for granted, supermarkets full of fresh produce from a dozen countries, dairy sections stretching down whole aisles, freezer cases of frozen meals ready to heat, is entirely dependent on a technology that only became universal within our grandparents' lifetimes. The refrigerator also transformed the household. Because food could be stored, it did not need to be purchased every day. The daily trip to market, which had been a fixture of ordinary life for millennia, gradually became weekly. Recipes changed to accommodate ingredients that would only be available occasionally. Leftovers became normal. Households needed less kitchen labour. The domestic servant, whose job had partly been to shop and cook every day, disappeared from middle-class houses as the refrigerator arrived. Women's lives, in ways feminists have observed, were altered in complicated ways. Some labour was reduced, but expectations of variety and abundance rose. Ice itself, meanwhile, went from being a rare luxury to being so cheap that we drop it into drinks without a thought. The freezer compartment of a modern refrigerator produces, on demand, more ice than a 19th century upper-middle-class household could have hoped to store for a whole summer. In this respect, we live in a world in which the abundance of cold that only Nero could once command is available to almost everyone. Part 7. The continuing story of cold. The story of ice and refrigeration is not over. In our own century, cold continues to shape human life in ways that even the pioneers of the ice trade could not have imagined. The global food system is, in effect, one enormous refrigerator. Fresh food travels through what industry professionals call the cold chain, a network of refrigerated trucks, warehouses, ships, and airplanes that keeps produce at consistent temperatures from harvest to your kitchen. A grape grown in Chile in January can appear on a table in Norway in February, still crisp, because it has never left the cold chain for more than a few minutes. This is one of the great logistical achievements of the modern world, and, like so much of modernity, we barely notice it. Cold is also essential to modern medicine. Vaccines must be kept cold, sometimes very cold, from manufacture to injection. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the requirement that some vaccines be stored at ultra-low temperatures posed one of the great challenges of global distribution, especially in warm climate countries with weak electrical infrastructure. The maintenance of the vaccine cold chain is now recognized as one of the most important public health tasks in the world. Blood banks depend on cold. Organs for transplant depend on cold. Modern hospitals could not operate without refrigeration. And cold has environmental consequences. Refrigeration and air conditioning together consume an enormous share of the world's electricity, perhaps as much as 10% by some estimates, and growing rapidly as more of the world's population enters middle-class living standards in tropical countries. The refrigerants themselves, though the worst ozone-destroying chemicals of the 20th century have been phased out, remain potent greenhouse gases in some formulations. The pursuit of cold, which once cost so much human labour and shipping capacity, now costs a growing share of the planet's climate stability. There is a strange sort of moral irony here. For most of history, human beings desperately sought cold and were willing to pay any price for it. Now, cold is so cheap and so universal that we cannot imagine living without it. And yet the very ease with which we produce it is beginning to warm the planet as a whole. The empire of cold that Frederic Tudor built has become an unimagined trap. And so we return, one more time, to the ordinary, to the small, hard cube of ice that right now, someone, somewhere, is dropping into a glass with a clink. It looks so plain, so instantly available, so thoughtless. But you know its secret now. You know that emperors and sultans once employed teams of porters to haul snow from the mountains just to have chilled sherbet in July. You know that Persian engineers built enormous mud brick towers to store winter's water into the desert summer, and that some of these towers still stand in Iran today. You know that a young Boston merchant named Frederic Tudor, laughed at by his own family, built an industry that sailed frozen New England pond water to Havana and Calcutta, and made cold available to ordinary people for the first time in history. You know that Norwegian ice cooled the fish of London's markets, that ice-refrigerated rail cars transformed the American meat industry, and that a whole daily figure, the Iceman with his wagon and his tongs, was for a century as familiar as the postman is today. And you know that a small humming motor in your kitchen brought the whole cold empire crashing down in a single generation, and made the substance that once cost more than gold cheaper than the trays it now falls into. Ice teaches us the fastest lesson of this series, that entire industries, enormous, profitable, employing tens of thousands, connecting continents, can rise and vanish in the span of 100 years. That what seems permanent is often just a stage. That a technology so new we can hardly remember its inventors has already restructured almost every aspect of how we eat, how we live, and how our cities are shaped. The next time you drop a cube into a glass or open the freezer without thinking, remember for just a moment the whole strange history behind that small, cold weight. You are performing an act that Nero would have called a miracle, and that his snow couriers would not have believed possible in the ordinary home of an ordinary person. The empire of cold is all around you, silent and constant, and you barely notice it. That too is the story of everything you use. Sleep well, and when we meet again, we will follow the story of another substance that changed the world in an entirely different way. The transparent, gleaming material that first allowed our species to see through walls, look up at stars, and preserve wine for a decade. Glass. Until then, good night.